Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, senior editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web, at Safe Camp Audio on social media. On this week's episode, we brought in frequent Imprint Weekly Podcast guest Marina Nitze to riff with me about the fairly eventful end of 2025 in child welfare, at least when it comes to federal policy and funding. Nitze has worked in federal government. She's been prominently involved in organizing around best practices in the child welfare field. And on top of all that, she is a tech expert, so she felt like the perfect person to bring on here. We'll have our annual Best of podcast going up next week, so look out for that as well. Put 12 clips from some of our best interviews from 2025 into that. And on the Imprint website, we'll be counting down the top 10 storylines of the year each day until we reach December 31st. And before we get to the conversation today, let me remind our listeners once again that the Imprint is participating in the National News Match campaign, which means every dollar you give us in a donation between now and the end of the year will be doubled. Your support fuels powerful investigative reporting. It lifts up voices that are too often unheard and helps hold the powerful accountable while giving communities the coverage that they deserve. Give today and make your impact go twice as far in supporting journalism that makes a difference. You can do that at imprintnews.org/donate. And now, without further ado, here is my conversation with Marina Nitze. We are joined today by Marina Nitze, co-author of Hack Your Bureaucracy. I'm going to keep shilling that every time she's on here. Pioneer behind the Child Welfare Playbook, and as I've described her before, the unseen hand behind change in foster care. She felt like the perfect person to have on here to sort of end the year on the podcast, just try to parse through the many things going on in child welfare. So Marina, as always, thank you for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thanks, John. You're too kind.
I think you've been on here the most at this point, so I've probably gotten enough favorites out of you. Why don't we tell the folks what are your holiday traditions? We're heading into holiday season. What's like the Nitze family? Either when you're growing up or now, what do you like to do?
Oh yeah, so we have all the cousins come out the week after Christmas, and my niece Juliet's birthday is that first night. So every year we have a themed birthday party. This year it is Percy Jackson. So I've been designing a complicated week-long quest for all the kids to unlock their prophecies with like missing keywords and secrets, and then I have to do a scavenger hunt around town. So that is my tradition every year, is we do some sort of extended week-long birthday celebration for Juliet.
I love that. That's awesome. So we got that, and we low-key got Juliet's favorite book out of that, I think, Percy Jackson, right?
Yeah. In preparation, I, of course, had to read the 17 Percy Jackson books, and I recommend them. I was really engaged with them, even as an adult. So,
whoa. I'm going to throw my own, just recommending. Nobody ever asked me my favorites because I'm the asker. Since we're talking books, I just read this book called Gales of November that came out about the end of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the ship on the Great Lakes, and I highly recommend it to anybody. It's an insanely interesting book examining like why this thing happened. That hasn't happened again since, right? We talk a lot about safety on this and the things that prompt people to kind of reconsider it. There hasn't been a ship that sank since then in 1975. But the guy went out and found family members from everybody who was on the ship. It was incredible.
That sounds awesome. It reminds me, one of my favorite books ever is Young Men in Fire by Norman MacLean, which is a true story about the Man Gulch fire and the smoke jumpers, and how that fire that killed almost all of the smoke jumpers on it, smoke jumpers have never died that way again because of the lessons learned in the Man Gulch. And I think there's so much to learn there, right? In so many spaces of when an accident happens, how do we make sure that doesn't happen again?
Absolutely. Okay, so let's start with just talking about some of the indicators. What do you want to call it? Beacons, signals that are coming out of Washington, D.C. about what the next, 3 odd years are going to be about when it comes to child welfare. The administration has announced that it will be making a home for every child, which is a banner that now hangs on their headquarters. The North Star goal for Trump's second term, which is top official on child welfare, Alex Adams, has described as a mission to both lower the numerator, right, number of kids in foster care, and the denominator, or raise the denominator number of homes, right? So, what do you think of that as a distilled mission, and what questions do you have about it all as somebody who has really thought, I'm sure, quite a lot about both and worked very intentionally on that denominator part about capacity?
Yeah. So I will say high level, like I'm thrilled about Alex Adams' leadership and I'm really excited about this North Star. Having a North Star is one of the things in Hack Your Bureaucracy, right? So of course I am aligned to it. But to talk through it, the first time I heard about it, I will say that I was nervous, thinking about where they're going to think about the number of kids and the number of homes, because kids are not widgets, right? And we've definitely seen some mistakes in foster care historically, where you can look in a state and say, oh, you have 2,000 open beds and 500 kids in foster care. Easy peasy. Look at that. You've got 4 homes for every child. And yet the children are sleeping in the office or in hotels or bouncing constantly. And so that math doesn't really work. That's how we developed the adverse placement score, which is live in 13 states now. I think we've talked about it a little bit, but to some, an adverse placement is when a child is not with kin and they are institutionalized and or separated from their siblings and or moved far from home, right? So away from their school, away from their community. And we work really carefully in states because there's always edge cases there, right? Sometimes it is appropriate to separate siblings for various reasons. Sometimes the child really does need an inpatient medical event, hospitalization. Sometimes there is a good reason to move far from home. But on the whole, no. But in an adverse placement, or if you're with kin, that is considered a non-adverse placement. And we've just seen these incredible statewide shifts very quickly when states see this data. They work on it with us, right? We're not outsiders running a report card and handing it to them. We're really working with them in the day to day. And they're seeing like, oh my God, I had increased our placement area thinking that that would help reduce group home placements. And that helped, right? The more homes you can look at, potentially, the more possible matches you have. But didn't realize that in the course of doing that, we had deprioritized keeping kids in their schools and communities. So now we're actually moving a ton of kids unnecessarily out of a school and then also moving kids from another county into that school. So we're swapping all these placements that could have actually kept children in their schools and communities. That's not only important for educational stability, right? That's important for visiting your parents, seeing your friends and your sports, and also for social worker retention and job satisfaction. I don't know any social workers that love driving 3-4 hours for me to visit each kid when they could be in their community. So I will say, when I first heard the denominator numerator, I was a little bit nervous, but every time you hear Alex talk about it, it's very clear that he's thinking about it in a much more nuanced way. He's thinking about more kin placements, kin licensing, expanding the definition of kin where it's not as expansive as it needs to be so that we have more kin that are available. And then thinking about how we're changing that denominator, how are we safely keeping kids out of foster care? So once I heard him explain it that way, then I was totally on board and really excited. And I think there's a ton of ways we can make progress like that as a community.
Yeah, I see those like kind of going hand in hand if you have the broader view of what it would be to have a good home and moving more towards adverse placement scores or something like it being kind of the law of the land, so to speak, right? So let's kind of zoom in on the APS thing. You said we. You're a part of a lot of we's. So which we is?
This we is the Foster Insights team at the University of Chicago. It's led by Noah Duncan.
Okay. Now, you said 13 states are kind of employing this already?
To various extents. We have a couple of partners that deploy it, and then we do it directly in a number of states as well.
Right. Like I'm so bad at math, the 37-ish states that don't currently do it, how hard would it be to get from pretty bad to I'm able to spit out an adverse placement score, and track it pretty easily?
Measuring the adverse placement score, the issue we found most places is that just jurisdictions, their data people are way overwhelmed. Mm-hmm. Almost always they are like awesome, smart, capable people, but we're asking them to do like 10 million things. I know Alex has spoken a little bit publicly about wanting to, rethink some of the administrative burden that's on states. And this certainly feels like a place where, hey, if your data team is busy, assembling AFCARs from glue and duct tape, maybe we could rethink the way we're pulling AFCARs and then free them up so they could do more of this kind of analysis. And so, step one, it's not wildly complicated to calculate adverse placement score, but generally jurisdictions have wanted us to lean in and help just because they don't have the capacity in terms of hours to do it. But then when you're saying like, okay, let's say you're at the worst adverse placement. So I guess 100% of your placements are adverse. So nobody's with kin, everyone's, separated from their siblings. Generally, you can look at your adverse placement score data. And what jurisdictions have really appreciated is looking at it statewide is not as helpful as looking at it when you start zooming in. Because when and in any state, you look statewide and you're like, hey, you need 2,000 foster homes for sibling groups of 5. They're going to that's such a huge task. It's so hard. Our brains just sort of shut off. But when you go into a school district and you say, hey, we need one family that speaks Vietnamese that could take a sibling group of 4 or 5. Could you help us think through that? That becomes like a totally different tractable problem. So the more that you can measure adverse placement scores and zoom in, and then you're going to start seeing like, wait a minute, this county has a kin placement of 70%. This county next door has a kin placement rate of 10%. What's going on? What help might that county need to get their kin placement way up? And there's all sorts of different solutions, but often when there's that huge disparity, there's some lever that you might be able to pull. It might be that that they lost their kin finder, right? We found some counties where we look and we see 100% of kids are placed out of county. That's a flag. And we found that when we talk to the foster parents, they say, oh, I hate the placement worker, so I won't answer her phone calls. That's fixable. Or we've heard this county pays me more than that county, so I take placements from this county and not that county. Not as easy to fix, but fixable, right? But again, when you zoom in, that's where I'm a big believer in finding those hyperlocal solutions. Can you do more recruitment of a specific kind? Can you partner more with schools? Is there a challenge in getting fingerprints that's actually the reason why you can't get more kin placements? Or sometimes, there may be a culture within a team of 1 or 2 people that the easiest thing to do is always call, Mary. I'm making Mary up, but we all have a Mary who will say yes to any placement and then disrupt that placement always at day 10 or whatever it may be, right? It may be easier to always call Mary than to try to find grandma or an aunt or uncle or a teacher. And how can we shift that burden so that it is not the easiest thing is to call Mary? A bunch of jurisdictions have put in things that have been called like firewall policies, which basically means if I'm going to make a non-kin placement, I have to explain to my boss why I'm making that non-kin placement. I have to walk through what steps have I taken to find kin. And if the steps I've taken are none, or, oh, well, I tried one phone number and 20 minutes ago, that's going to not meet the bar, right? So that's going to hopefully nudge the workers more in the kin finding direction.
Like an internal reasonable efforts hearing before you would go to court or anything like that.
Yeah. And it's not meant to be a paperwork exercise or anything like that. It's really meant to be a nudge. There's this great book called The Friction Project by Bob Sutton and Huggy Rao. I think we all think a lot about like when we're improving a process, how do we remove friction from it, right? A lot of kin licensing was how are we removing friction? How are we removing steps? But sometimes you want to add friction. And I think making a non-kin placement, like within a half an hour of a child coming into care, that's a place where we want to add a little bit of friction to make sure that we really are trying to find kin first.
You mentioned, the assistant secretary's very, very public disdain for overuse of subregulation. I think he's been pretty clear. I think I'm going to paraphrase here. I think he said he found 43,000 pages of it and he wants to get rid of like 98% of it. Not that many moons ago, you were on a team right at Veterans Affairs that kind of got things in order and changed like how much. And I was just thinking about that as I prepared to talk to you. Did that come into play for you guys? I mean, when you went and looked, was there a lot of paperwork and regs that it was necessary to get rid of? Just your experience in government and bureaucracy suggests to you that he's right, that we've piled up too many things.
I think he's definitely right. Even if you think about, if you've tried to read the Child Welfare Policy Manual lately, I mean, the web page barely loads and is barely searchable. So even if I am trying to find something in the however many tens of thousands of pages, it's very difficult to find. And then what are the stakes, right? You're in tons of trouble from a state's perspective if you didn't follow that thing in an IM from 1992 that you arguably couldn't find in the first place. My experience at the VA was much more on the paperwork side. I think ACF is probably more on the regulation side. You know, when I started at the VA, we had over 1,500 websites. We had 3 different website registries that gave you different numbers of websites, even. Like, talk about insanity. We had so many forms, and yet you could do almost nothing online as a veteran when I started in 2013. And a lot of that was saying, like, okay, we have 83 different benefit lines. How are we going to start combining them so that I'm not asking you for 83 or 100 different forms? I'm asking you for your name and your address one time, right? And then I'm going to build on that only with the maybe 1 or 2 extra questions that I really need to get you to that next benefit. And that took a long time, but I think it's also such a beacon of hope because it's only been 10 years since we launched the revamped va.gov. And the VA, now you can do everything online. You can apply for all your benefits in one place. You can manage all of them in one place. You can call one phone number. Veterans' trust in the VA has gone up like tens of percents in just 1 decade. And that's across all administrations. And VA is arguably like the largest bureaucracy in the world. Certainly it's the largest civilian bureaucracy because it's not the military. And so I think that's a pretty hopeful message. If it, 10 years is very long in one way and then very short in another, right? Even if we think about what are the poverty guidelines haven't been updated since 1996, right?
Yeah.
That's a really long time.
Like pulling at the analogousness of these two things, I suppose, maybe the reason the VA is such a paperwork heavy problem that you guys had is because it is really essentially just a federal endeavor. But when you think about child welfare, the regs are with the feds and it creates the paperwork at the local level, right? So like the paperwork version is devolved down to the people complying with the regs and things.
Yeah. And the challenge there is that I really learned when we did the KIN model licensing standards is that states did not want to come up with their forms and policies and regulations from scratch. That is a ton of work. It's hard work. And they don't necessarily have the resources for it. So I think a huge reason, the KIN model licensing standards adoption is just nuts, right? We've already got half the country live now, with the other half of the country committed to going live by 2027. That's 100% adoption in 3 years. Like, that's totally insane. But I think a lot of that is because the states, they co-designed the model standards with us, right? But then we made it very copy and pastable. They don't have, and I think we hopefully threaded the line well between, it's not a mandate from on high that you must use this exact form and this exact word and this exact policy. But here's enough of it so that we did like 80 to 90% of the grunt work for you, and you can customize it to the needs of your state and jurisdiction and your consent decrees or whatever it may be. I think that had a lot to do with it being adopted so quickly. And I think a lot about like what other spaces might benefit from model standards like that, where a state can get, most of the stuff covered and also tested, right? We worked with hundreds of subject matter experts with kinship caregivers. We went to their homes. We went to their homes on permafrost to learn that they can't actually get bed frames delivered, working with, tribes that said, hey, we don't have county-run recycling services. So when you make that a requirement, I can't get licensed, right? We worked through a lot of those edge cases. And I don't think you have to do that individually in every state or tribe from scratch. If you can get that kind of nationally and get that bucket, and then every state or tribe can do that last mile, that really seems to me like a model for a lot of other things that we could do as well.
Yeah, I want to make sure people know what Marina is talking about here. So the Biden folks put out a regulation when they were there that, it's a little more complex than this, but essentially said you have the ability as a state to approve kin in a fashion that is not identical to how you would do non-relative foster homes. And, I think the part that actually is less talked about is that there's supposed to also be kind of financial parity there, and that you can approve them and also you should pay them the same. Financially support them the same. So what you were just talking about is you and a coalition of others have developed these kind of model standards and gotten a lot of uptake right away. So I'm sure I hadn't really considered this before, but anytime there's a change in administration, you never know what's going to happen. So you must have been thinking like, man, this could have all been for nothing if they just kind of broadly rescind a lot of the last administration's work. But it sounds like you feel pretty confident that the folks staffing up at ACF are kind of in line with the thinking of that.
I mean, I've also said it publicly a few times about how kin licensing is really important for part of his Home for Every Child. I am not losing sleep at night worrying that kin licensing will go away. And also I would say it's not even a bipartisan issue, but my experience has been a nonpartisan issue in terms of states adopting. Like the first states and tribes to go live, there was no blue or red or purple alignment there. Different jurisdictions had different incentives for moving forward as they did. But I think there's very, very broad interest in supporting kin and closing that gap between kin placement and supporting kin. Like a big thing that we were trying to solve. And there was not great data on this. You had the best data by far around like licensed kin was when before the kin licensing standards came out, about 21% of kinship caregivers with placement of children were licensed, which meant they were getting support. And not just foster care and maintenance payments, but in many states, it's access to childcare, access to respite, access to wraparound services, even sometimes access to the kinship navigator supports in some places were restricted if you were not licensed. So these are families where we said, it's safe enough here for you to care for this child who is technically a dependent of the state, right? But it's not safe enough to support this placement. Like that's a gap that I was very passionate about closing.
I remember being at a conference out in California, and there's a person I know in the crowd, and we were listening to a conversation about exactly this. Just the role of kin, how to better support kin, and I cannot remember exactly what prompted me to jot it down, and then she also said she had the same thought at the same time, but it was about the idea of, does anybody or should somebody consider the idea of pre-registering relatives, pre-registering people in this country to serve in that role if it came to it? Do you know of anybody that's thought about that or tried that?
Oh, for sure. There are states that do that now. And we encourage it as a practice, even in the model standards, we mention it, that if a family has come to the attention of child welfare and you're not at the point of removal, but it may be at risk, how are you engaging supportive adults and kin in that process? Ideally, that could help. Those kin could jump in and support, and we never remove the child, right? It's even better. But if you could clear grandma for licensure, get her licensed as kin before we knew that removal was necessary, is hopefully kind of like a plan C, not plan A. There are places that do that. And the places that don't do that, I mean, this is a great place where like the regulation and all information memorandums come in. It's a lot of confusion about whether or not they're allowed to. So there are states like Hawaii that your background check with fingerprints is good for a year. So you could, the family comes to the attention of child welfare. You're worried about removal, but that's not the current plan. You could get grandma fingerprinted and run, especially her out-of-state child abuse and neglect registry checks, because that's the thing right now that can still take months and months and months and months. Get that going right away. And then if you do need to remove later, grandma has already cleared those hurdles. A bunch of states still believe that they cannot do that. And if they ask me, I am happy to explain to them why they can do that. And hopefully they're listening now. But that's a great practice to be able to enable that the kin licensure steps to be completed ahead of time, especially the two that take the longest, which is the fingerprint and out-of-state child abuse and neglect registry check if that relative lived in another state in the last 5 years.
Hi, everyone. It's journalist Lisa Ling, and I'm sure you will agree that it is so important for there to be good, trustworthy journalism on children and families, and nobody does that better than the Imprint. I am such a devotee of the Imprint, and I listen to the Imprint Weekly Podcast because it is so comprehensive and so substantive, and it is by far the best news source for anyone interested in critical issues like foster care, juvenile justice, youth homelessness, and so much more. During this holiday season of giving, I hope you'll consider donating to the Imprint. If you do so between now and the end of the year, your donation will be doubled thanks to the National Newsmatch campaign. To give is so easy. Go to imprintnews.org/donate. That's imprintnews.org/donate. Thank you so, so much.
So home for every child, the utmost goal. The other thing that obviously happened in the last couple of months here is that the Trump administration and President Trump himself, with the first lady, put out an executive order on foster care. Not often that we see that. That was with pomp and circumstance. Lots of people there. I want to go through kind of each of the three pieces with you because I'm interested in your thoughts on a lot of it. So, the first of the three kind of instructions is around modernizing the child welfare systems. Let's start with the data. So AFCARS is our sort of pro forma way of getting numbers from the state up to the feds. It's actually as close to up to date as it's been in a while, but still a year behind present day, basically. And that is something they seem to think must change. So what do you think is the realistic ceiling for national child welfare data? Do you think we could get to something like the Department of Labor's, employment reports that are so famous, where it's as close to real time as possible? Is that in your mind like an attainable thing for this field, or even appropriate?
I mean, technically, it's absolutely attainable. In terms of appropriateness, I mean, there's always that fear of knee-jerk reactions or the media misinterpreting or seeing a number. And so I think you have to be really careful about how data is presented and shared, over what time period, right? Because if you look at like a week, that's not going to give you a very representative view of what's happening. We've seen all sorts of dashboards where, like, for example, you probably know that February has 28 days. There are all sorts of times when people like freak out about February as an outlier for something because they're not appreciating that there's simply fewer days in it, right? So I think we want to be really thoughtful and careful. And I understand why jurisdictions would be pretty scared about having real-time data out there. But I think the real barrier we have to that right now is that most states are handcrafting their AFCARS reports because there's not a way to naturally collect the data in the course of doing their everyday work. That's something that like a CWIS transformation should have fixed. It's not too late to have that as a goal. But I think a combo there is like, what data do we actually care about and do we actually want to measure? And how can we collect that much more naturally in the course of doing our work? So it's not like a data entry task. It's not a duct tape and spaghetti afterthought. That's what's going to change the timeliness measure. And then we can decide together. We can see that data in real time, sort of privately, right? And then we could decide over time how much we wanted to make that public right away, or if there was some sort of lag. I suspect if we were designing it really well, there'd probably be some numbers that were in real time, like the number of kids in care today. I don't know that would be a data point that we couldn't have nationally, but we may want to time delay other measures or keep some internally because they would be misinterpreted.
I think that's a good way to look at it. It's like, what are the 4 to 10 things it would be great to know in as close to real time as possible? You'd want to know, how many kids are in the system. I think it would be good to know if there was like this sudden drop off in homes. I don't know if that has to be like month to month. That would be something you'd want to know. It's like, oh, what happened? Why did we just lose 100 homes? Like, did an organization go out of business that was supporting them, or like you said, like just a terrible worker who's causing people to leave, or what? Yeah.
And I think that's the sort of thing that, like, if a jurisdiction feels like their data is just going to be published for them to be kind of shamed and turned red, I don't think that is what we want. I don't think that helps any children or any families. But if we are really rethinking, and I would be very excited about this, AFCARs and CSFRs and PIPs in the scheme of like, how do we actually get better? How do we actually like compare one another too? And this has been a real benefit of some of the adverse placement score work. And I hope we continue to show up this way with states. We don't show up saying like, oh my God, you suck at this. How, death. We say, oh man, I saw a pattern like that in another state. Here's what they did. Here's what it meant. Mm-hmm. The really overly basic example is the placement worker that nobody would answer the phone, or the counties where one county pays more than another. But when a director or someone in the position of decision making can see that data in relative real time and ask the questions exactly that you're saying, like, wait a minute, where did 100 placements just go? And if the answer is, oh, well, every year we just don't renew anybody that hasn't taken a placement in a year on Thursday, and that happened to be the Thursday, maybe that's an explanation. But then it's also like, what's happening to our retention? I mean, a different thing that I would love to see our field focus more on is the experience of foster parents, both kin and non-kin. I think we as a system bully them A big measure that changed a lot when I was at the VA was saying, like, what is the veteran's experience of the VA? Can we measure that? Would a veteran recommend the VA to another veteran? And when we started measuring that number, it was in like the 20%, which is pretty embarrassing, right? For a system that is designed for veterans to be like, nope, actually, my close friend who I like literally served in theater with and risked our lives together, I would not send them here for healthcare. Like, that is pretty damning.
Yeah.
Now it's in the 80s. And it's, you can't improve what you don't measure, or whatever they say about that, but really measuring that and getting a lot of people to center that in their jobs and their performance plans, I think changed a lot of how the VA showed up. I think we could do that in fostering as well. I mean, our retention rates are terrible. I don't think we do nearly a good job of recruiting kin caregivers to stay and take non-kin children who could literally be next door to them if we had better kind of insight into some of that data. And I also think that we have the system is not designed to support foster parents. Maybe it pays them, but like that's not the sort of support that we need. And if we looked more into why is our retention in the basement, and also why are our more experiencing homes dropping out more and more? I mean, every time we do a user research project with foster parents, the amazing ones, right? The ones that we all think of that have taken the hardest to place kids, they've taken tons of kids, they've stayed in touch with all these kids, et cetera. Almost universally, their feedback to us is, I am one straw away from ending this forever. I'm one straw away from this camel's back breaking and I'm out. And that's a scary precipice. And it doesn't have to be that way. We could change that.
Yeah. You referenced two different acronyms in the child welfare alphabet soup. That's okay. It's okay to do that. One was CWIS, the Comprehensive Child Welfare Information System, which is also kind of not directly called out in the executive order, but I think they're talking about it a little bit. They're, basically that, and then the CFSRs. I think my question for you is the same on both of them. There's a lot of frustration. Obviously, there was a lot of money poured into taking state systems that used to be called SACWIS from like the 80s, I think, and bring them into the CWIS world where they'd be more modular and agile and better overall, like in the way that you're describing. And then there's the CFSR, the Child and Family Service Reviews, which is our sort of periodic way of trying to assess performance, your use of federal money to produce outcomes in child welfare. So, and I think the common question is like, are these endeavors that I think almost everybody would agree are not going well? Things to just call it a day on and move on from? Or do you see either of those experiments as something that this administration or any other one could tinker with and get better?
I think both absolutely require starting anew. And if they can be done in a piloted, co-designed way, I think the goals, right? The goal of CWIS was that states would have modern technology systems that would serve children and families and that workers would be able to use easily. And I think subtext there with the data quality plans and other requirements there was that they'd be able to generate useful data at a time frame that the data was useful. That has completely not happened. CSFRs is a space I am admittedly less familiar with, but my understanding is that, it takes a ton of time on each state's part to go through them. There's a ton of fear, right? It's a very, very fear-based activity, which I don't think encourages like innovation or people coming together to really collaborate towards change. And if I understand correctly, basically nobody ever passes their CSFR ever, and we can't use them as a benchmark. So how could we, in the case of CSFR, it doesn't seem impossible to me that we could get maybe a few states that were willing to be brave to come together to say, actually, these are measures that we would find that we already measure perhaps ourselves internally. We know how to measure them. We would find it valuable to have benchmarks so we could learn from one another. I could see that world as being possible. If nobody can get out of their CSFR and they're not benchmarkable, then I'm not sure what the value is besides like creating a fear-based culture where the states are afraid of the feds, are afraid of kind of sharing, and they're way over engineering their administrative burden, which is ultimately negatively impacting their workers and then their families and their kids. On the CWIS side, like I know a thing or two about this because we did a lot of technology transformation at the VA, and the VA is way bigger than child welfare. And I don't say that to be like conceited. I'm saying this as a message of hope, right? We have 20 million veterans in America, including the largest integrated healthcare system in the world. And we were able to do things like combining, managing, and applying for all their benefits in one place and doing data collection and reporting in relative real time. Child welfare IT is just not that hard. It is not technically complicated, and we have somehow accepted that it must be. I would love to see it that we take, there's some great vendors in the space, there's some great players in the space, and they often can't play because they can't get into the RFP process at all, or they're expected to have this past performance, which we are way too nascent as a field to have past performance as a requirement in any CWIS contract. I'd love it if we could encourage some pilots and some demos of saying like, hey, what did it look like to build a really great family finding module, right? That like keeps track of grandma's phone number and everybody on the case, the cost of the kid's attorney, the social worker, the parents can all see, hey, nobody's called grandma in 6 months. What's up with that, right? And we could all have one plan. That's technically like not at all hard to do. And that's something that like, what if we competed on outcomes there and really lifted those pieces up? There's this concept called the strangler pattern, which I'll explain if you don't mind. It is not named after strangling human beings. It is named after how the fig tree roots work. Just to be clear that this is not a violent story. But my better analogy for how the strangler pattern works is from Harry Potter. If you've not read Harry Potter and you don't want to know how it ends, please fast forward 2 minutes. So in the Harry Potter books, right, we've got Harry Potter and the whole wizarding world, and they're fighting Voldemort. Voldemort is the SACWIS in this story. Voldemort is the old IT system that we were trying to replace, okay? For 6.5 books, the wizarding world goes at Voldemort directly. They're trying to kill the SACWIS and replace it wholly. Does not work, right? Voldemort gets stronger than ever. There's billions of pounds of Muggle property damage. A bunch of Harry's family dies. Like, it's not a good look. What ultimately defeats Voldemort, the SACWIS, is the Horcruxes. You take one Horcrux, which is family finding, one Horcrux, which is foster parent licensing, one Horcrux, which is, making community pathways referrals for prevention services. You do each of those really super well. You co-design them with your agency employees and with your families. You think about the data you're trying to collect through that. And then as you do that, you kill Horcrux after Horcrux. At the end, all that's left in your SACWIS is this like little weaselly Voldemort bit. And that you can kill and replace with a contract. So that is how I think this absolutely could work. And I would love to see it work that way. So we have to just kill Voldemort, the SACWIS.
Let me see if I just passed the Harry Potter analogy test. Because I'm hearing you right there. The idea is, so SACWIS is this powerful figure because it is just the centralized thing we've always had. And so you just build modularly around it with things that don't need it. Until you have so many of those, you just connect those and you never need the other thing. Is that really what?
Yes. By one edit might be that the Horcrux can take a piece of the SACWIS out. Most SACWISs never did foster parent licensing. So like that's a great place that you might start because it's not in your SACWIS at all, right? But then there might be a thing in your SACWIS of like, where are children placed? Okay, you're going to clearly define what's in your SACWIS for keeping track of where children are placed. You're going to take that piece out. Now that's your next Horcrux. You're going to design that really well. It's going to work on your placement desk. Is going to love it. Everybody's going to have good, accurate data about where your kids are. Then maybe your next piece is another one where you take a bit out. And then at the end, you hopefully don't have very much left of your Voldemort. And then you can kind of do one last whack with your wand and then get rid of it.
Thank you for that. That was amazing. And absolutely is a dead lock to be the clip that we share on this podcast. Going back to CFSR for a minute, we can move on. It's really interesting you describe it as fear-based because I wonder if one of the challenges with this as something that continues on is the fear is all implied and not delivered, isn't it? I mean, if everybody fails, then that doesn't mean there's a lot of fear of failure. And I think I'm going to say this as somebody who's asked before years ago for some records on this. I don't think a lot of people have actually lost money because they failed CFSR. I don't think that the feds have at any point have been particularly animated to take money out of child welfare for failure. So what are you afraid of? What are they afraid of in your framing?
That is such a great question because this comes down to like so much change in the public sector overall, right? Like we haven't historically seen them take away money or end systems or take them over. And yet there's absolutely like deep, intense fear-based when you get to the individual workers that are in charge of this. I'll give you an example. Just over the last few years, as I've been working more with foster parent licensing, a huge fear has been about whether or not a foster parent is required to print out their foster parent license and tape it to the wall. I have had many conversations, a couple of which people literally cried in fear to me because they're moving towards like a licensing system that is online, which generally are like awesome and make a lot of this work faster and easier and more accurate. And just absolutely terrified that they're going to get a CSFR audit and then somebody's going to go to that foster parent's house and see that they did not tape their foster parent license to the wall. That's the sort of stuff that that I don't think that level of fear needs to be there, but requires like rethinking that relationship and how the CSFR works. Because whether or not, I mean, you're totally correct that I don't think that historically there's been appetite or that currently there's appetite to claw back funds based on CSFRs, but that's not how the like day-to-day CSFR process works in a jurisdiction. It's totally one of terror and tracking down every last piece of paper and dotting every I in a way that's not helping any families. No kid, I do not believe anybody needs to tape their foster parent license to the wall or that has any impact on safety in any way.
Yeah, it almost feel gross to a kid, honestly, to have it be like I live in a restaurant, restaurants.
Yeah, that is a great framing. And a flip, like we've done some user research where there have been communities of people where like the whole street is licensed foster parents that none of whom have ever taken a placement. And it's like a social badge to have the foster parent license up on the wall. Like they all look for one another's, even though none of them are fostering it. Very strange, but I'm also like, this is also a perverse incentive where like I've given you some sort of badge of being like a good human when you're actually not taking the kids at all. So it has all these perverse kind of side effects.
Yeah. The middle of the executive order is kind of what's in line with the, what's going to be the portfolio for the First Lady. Really focuses on older youth, and it kind of divides between some tweaks to the Chafee program. And then I guess a little more interesting to me, it instructs to build this online platform to help people who have been in foster care by assessing their current needs and sort of helping them make sure they know what they're entitled to and what's available. Now, I actually think that's an extremely important endeavor. I think that's one of the most sad realities in child welfare is how many people don't know what they could be getting by way of support. And I think that, the work that iFoster did with their community surveys surfaced that other people have. I'm curious from you, because you've been in federal positions before, you've been on the outside of that. What are your thoughts on like the federal government owning that construction of an app or a platform as opposed to anybody else? I think there's some states and organizations that are kind of already like playing in that space. So I don't know. What are your thoughts there on like how best to kind of move that ball forward?
Yeah, I mean, this has probably the strongest parallel to my VA work, where I think everybody who served should have access to every possible benefit they could possibly unlock. And a huge challenge, which I'm not going to say solved yet, but we've made progress on, is them even understanding what benefits exist and what they could benefit from. The key to me here is that the tool itself is not the solution. The work needed to map out what are the benefits, where are they in states or counties or nonprofits or federal, whatever, that is the work. And if there is a way to thread that, you hear about independent living programs in states where there's like 4 or 5 housing options alone. And that kid is supposed to try to figure out like which one of the 5 they qualify for, right? And amplify that by the complexity of the federal government. I don't think it's bad if the federal government has the tool, if they're helping drive that work and there's data sharing. But again, the tool itself will be the thing that's announced and that people can like touch and click on. But the real benefit is if it drives the work to understand and plain language and make accessible what all those benefits are.
So the app will be as good as the mapping that populates it.
For sure. So if the app is, and this applies anywhere out of child welfare too, right? If the map is just, here's a list of resources, in a PDF form, have at it, or maybe a searchable PDF, like that's not the work. The work you want to do is, I'm going to sit down with hundreds of actual youth and they're going to try it and they're going to walk through the search and the filters and the things that they're looking for. And it has to make it it has to surface all the things, and it has to make it very, very clear, like whether they qualify and what the next step is. And sometimes a huge benefit of that work can be simplifying it. Like maybe we shouldn't have 5 housing programs for older youth that have 5 different sets of eligibility criteria, right? And is it possible to right size that so that all 5 of them have the same eligibility criteria?
Yeah. Yep. Okay, then the third part of this is the maximizing partnerships with Americans of Faith, which both, instructs HHS to address existing policies, and I'm going to quote here, so I'm precise, inappropriately prohibit participation in federally funded child welfare programs by individuals or organizations based on their sincerely held religious beliefs or moral convictions. And then also kind of the inverse of that, to increase partnerships. So go out there and figure out how to have evolve faith-based entities and people more. So let's start with the sort of easier part of that. In your perch at Child Welfare Playbook and that, have you guys seen really shining examples of public faith-based partnerships that might be that model for incentivization? Things that have really gone so well in that space that it's like, if you're going to do that, start here.
I've been really encouraged by Care Portal, which has a large faith-based community. And what Care Portal does, and we've done some data work with them and some partnership with them, is, and this applies outside of kinship caregivers, but the work we did together was with kinship caregivers. If a kin caregiver needs a bed, a home repair, rides, some sort of resource, either to establish a placement or to continue a placement, they can make a request through the portal. They almost universally are fulfilled by faith-based organizations. And that has made a material, measurable impact on kin placement rates and stability. So I will call that out as a positive. I know that Every Child, which is in Oregon, Arkansas, and Tennessee, has also done a lot of faith-based work to help close the gap, where if you look at, where our non-kin foster homes needed the most, where might we be able to find them? And not just for placements, but for supporting placements. So if your faith calls you to support youth in foster care, maybe you could foster, but maybe you could also provide rides or mentorships or a bicycle or homework tutoring or whatever else it may be to help support a foster placement. So I think those are 2 highlights I would definitely look at there.
Yeah. Okay. So on the thornier side of this, we have in this country now, I want to say it's like 13 states, maybe more now, that already basically shield faith-based organizations from any adverse actions in child welfare if they choose to be discriminatory in who they're going to work with. And that can mean, and often does mean, gay couples, gay people, single people from a different religion. It's a lot, but obviously the LGBT community is particularly affected by that. And then there's other states that do quite the opposite and require non-discrimination, contractual language and agreements with everybody that's working. So when I look at the language they're using in the order, when I think of like the possible actions that trail it, the ones that seemed likeliest to me, I guess one would be to attempt to make those faith-based protection laws that like 13 or so states have somehow federal policy, like tied to your funding. I'll say that feels like it would need to be a law to me instead of an executive action. And in fact, that has been the case. Like there have been laws that have gone nowhere that have been introduced on that. And then there's the more targeted approach, I guess, would be to directly warn a state that had a non-discrimination policy to change it or else, which seems to be the approach that this administration is taking with gender affirmation for caregivers. So, I don't have some like brilliantly worded question for you. This is something obviously like I think a lot of people in the field are grappling with. So how are you thinking about this all? And you're in touch with a lot of states. What's their anticipation level here and how are they thinking about it?
Here's what I'll say on this. Every child that has to come into foster care deserves a safe and affirming home for who they are. If, as a state, you will face a position where you're told that you can't have a blanket policy in any direction, then that does not mean that you cannot still very thoughtfully recruit homes that match the needs of the children in care, that you can't very thoughtfully place and match children based on their needs, and that you can't have a very clear escape hatch for if a child is placed in a home that is not a good match for a variety of reasons. And so I would say, like, you still have those powers as a state. And I would encourage you to use them, even if for whatever reason you find out, you are not allowed to use a blanket whole cross system policy.
I think that's solid advice. And just, this is me speaking a little bit more editorially than I normally would. I think that this has the potential. There's going to be states that fight back and push back hard on this. The courts, I don't think the courts they're going to prevail in court. I don't know how else to say it. So is this a long-term fight for what is appropriate within child welfare and within tolerance and all of these things? Is very different than, do I think you're going to win in court and how long that might take? So however you feel, I think that what you say resonates. The idea that, what are the ways, what are the, things you can push for on a state level to ensure that those safe places are there, or at least that kids who have a lot of their own ideas of who is safe to them, right? I mean, there may be a kid who is in the LGBT community who would prefer to be with like an uncle who they, maybe is not the most tolerant guy, versus a non-relative foster home who's filled out some affirmation statement. I know this is very uncomfortable to think about, and maybe I'm getting myself in trouble here, but it's coming. There's just going to have to be conversations about this. So
we have met youth like that, and I think it's so important that it ultimately, especially older youth, need to have a say. They may prefer that uncle, to your point, then they can stay with their siblings in their schools, versus an alternative, which may not even be a non-kin home that signed an affirmation statement, but is very likely for that older youth institutionalization, which is very scary and has all sorts of horrible outcomes. So I think we also have to be very realistic about the placement array that we have today versus the one that we wish existed.
So we're about to end 2025. We're about to start 2026. As you reflect back, and look forward at the same time here, what do you think are the priorities, looming challenges, things on your mind?
I'm ending the year unbelievably thankful and wowed and amazed by the adoption of the kin model licensing standards and the focus on kin placement. I've seen states that 2 years ago had goals of kin placement of 30, 35%, publicly stating goals of 80% and having very realistic plans to meet them. That is incredible change in a short amount of time, and I'm really excited about that. I think what's coming up, I think we have an administration that wants to roll up their sleeves, cut some thousands of pages of regulation that were ultimately harming kids and families and workers. Can we get data that isn't simply a data collection exercise, but is really going to move the needle for workers and families and children? I am excited about that, and to see where the focus on let's get more kin licensing, more kin placement, more kids safely kept out of foster care. I'm really excited about those focuses in 2026 and beyond.
Marina Nitze, thank you as always for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast. Thanks to Marina Nitze for joining us today on the Imprint Weekly Podcast. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at safecampaudio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Onjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you would consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. We would greatly appreciate if you would support our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is very easy. You just visit imprintnews.org/donate. And I might remind you one more time, because of the News Match campaign, if you do that before the end of 2025, your donation is going to be doubled. The website again to donate, imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews, and you can visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always get us over email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.